I am here to talk to you today about instruction and intervention, so that will be the focus of our time together for this hour. And I'll give you, towards the end of it, some resources that are specifically for parents as well as we move through today. So go ahead, and we're going to start off on your first. Today's objectives, so you can see these, is using evidence-based practices, so hopefully you'll understand these two things before you leave here today, kind of the two big ideas for today. Evidence-based practices during reading instruction and intervention to support students with dyslexia and reading for understanding, and then also using evidence-based practices to deliver reading instruction that can lead to higher literacy outcomes for all children, including students with dyslexia. And this is a connection to Maryland policy in your state. So looking at supplemental reading instruction, if you were here for Sarah Seiko's keynote this morning, she already has talked about a couple of these pieces. But in Maryland law is that supplemental reading instruction is to be evidence-based, sequential, systematic, explicit, and cumulative. And we'll talk about those as we're looking at instruction and intervention today. And then a mastery of the foundational skills, looking at phonological awareness, phonemic awareness and processing, phonics, and then accuracy and fluency with connected text, along with comprehension and vocabulary. And then screeners to identify students at risk for reading difficulties. I won't get much into the screener part of it, but we do know that we do need to be screening students to inform instruction. So that's the part that I'll be talking about really with screening. And there's another session today that really will go into depth more onto the screening piece of things. But I do want to acknowledge that screening does drive instruction. So those two are very linked with assessment and intervention and instruction provided in classrooms. So looking at prevention and early intervention, again, Sarah touched on a couple of these quotes in the keynote, but I did want to revisit them for those of you that were not able to attend that session, or just to reiterate these key points. That reading trajectories are established very early in a student's learning career as they start school and even before that. So we know that they are established early. With that being said, intensive intervention can also be started early because we've been able to identify the trajectory for students. So really looking at without that intensive intervention happening early, struggling readers do not normally catch up to their grade level peers. The later we wait to start, the more likely it is that those students will not catch up to grade level expectations. And that's that last bullet. The later the onset of intervention, the poorer the odds that students will actually catch up and become proficient readers. So looking at MTSS, or a multi-tiered system of support, typically this triangle it kind of represents multi-tiered systems of support in a lot of settings at a lot of school districts. And we'll just talk through kind of the layers of this triangle. And the multi-tiered system of support is to provide a structure of support for all students across tiers, and intensity builds as we move up that triangle. So this green piece here is tier 1, or universal level of prevention. And all students are part of that green band, that level of prevention support. 80% of the students, when instruction is clear and systematic and explicit, and what we know through the science of reading should be taught in classrooms, 80% of students should be successful in that tier 1 implementation. And that's also where that screening piece takes place. So looking at screening students in that tier 1 setting. And then the next layer is that yellow, and you can see it kind of fades into that yellow. Tier 2 is a targeted level of prevention, and 15% of students, even with solid core instruction, may still struggle to meet grade level expectations and learn to read. So they will need additional levels of support, and that's that tier 2 process. Progress monitoring feeds in at a tier 2 level. So as we're teaching students using more intensive instruction, we're also monitoring them a little more closely. So benchmark screening would happen about 3 times a year. In that bottom layer, progress monitoring is usually monthly or bi-monthly. So as the intervention increases and the instruction increases, the progress monitoring and the assessment data also increases. And then that tier 3 is that top little red section of the triangle. That's intensive level of prevention. So looking at the side of the triangle with percentage, about 5% of the students will need that tier 3 layer of prevention. If core is solid, so if we have a solid tier 1 and a solid tier 2, often I'm working in states, and as we, in my introduction, I work across the nation with states. We find flipped triangles, and our flipped triangle would be kind of what you would imagine. We would have 5 or 10% here that are being successful, and our intervention is like massive. That's not necessarily a problem with intervention. That's a problem with core instruction. So really looking at where are the triangles and where are the percentages. We know through research and evidence, 80% of students, when taught using explicit and systematic instruction, focused on the 5 main components of reading, 80% of those students should be able to attain knowledge of reading in that core instruction piece. For students with disabilities, they fall throughout that triangle. So we should have all students as part of that Tier 1 instruction, including students with disabilities, including dyslexia. And then throughout the triangle, those students are also getting services. Knowing that needs vary, instruction will vary as well in that Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 of support. So then looking at what are those tiers? Tier 1 is for all students. So again, having all students part of that core instruction, that green layer of the triangle, if you will. Screening determine who needs more of that ongoing comprehensive core support to continue to meet grade level expectations. High quality core curriculum materials that do teach all 5 ideas and 5 components of reading. Explicit and systematic instructional delivery, and we'll get into what that looks like and sounds like later on today in this session. And then database differentiated instruction. So looking at how can, in that Tier 1 of instruction, could small groups be differentiated to meet the needs of students in that classroom? And then periodic standardized performance data for that ongoing check for core support. Tier 2 is a targeted level of prevention. This is that yellow layer of the triangle for the MTSS system. Evidence-based intervention should be happening in that Tier 2 instruction, still with the big 5 ideas of reading, with fidelity. So making sure that instruction is delivered as intended. If we're using an intervention program, is that program being used as it was intended to be used? If it's not, that hasn't been researched, because we have that research through it. If we're not delivering it as it's been researched, we don't know if that's going to have an effect or not, because there's no research on whether it's not. We can make a guess that it's likely not going to be as effective as if we did it with fidelity, but we have to stick to what we know about that intervention program, because that's the way it was designed, that's the way it was researched, and that's how we know it's effective. So really looking at that fidelity of implementation. And then high leverage explicit instructional practices. So looking at explanations, multiple practice opportunities, lots of corrective specific feedback, and lots of student practice. And then instructional adjustments are guided by that progress monitoring piece. So as we're collecting more data in Tier 2, we're using that data to drive instructional decisions for that Tier 2 instruction. And then Tier 3 is that red triangle, that 5% of students who aren't responding to high quality Tier 1 and Tier 2 could be in that bubble. That could also be at that top of that triangle, students who are significantly below their grade level peers. So providing additional support, if I have a 3rd grader or a 4th grader that really is below and is working on a 1st grade level, they may be a Tier 3 of support because they're significantly behind their grade level peers. What happens during that intervention is just as important as the amount of time in that intervention. So just adding more time for the sake of adding more time doesn't change instruction. So what am I doing in that time, and how can I intensify the instructional time I have to increase the outcomes for students? So just adding time is not going to be enough. It really is about the instruction that's happening. Focusing on evidence-based intensification practices. It's not necessarily a different program. It may be intensifying the program I already have students in. And then ongoing analysis of, again, more frequent data collection. So thinking about that progress monitoring piece, we're going to tick it up a notch when they get to that top of the tier, top of the triangle support, and that may be daily and weekly mastery monitoring. So really using that daily and weekly mastery monitoring data to guide instruction. This is just a graphic to show what's happening as I have my 2 students here that are kind of the focus for this graphic. So in Tier 1, they're part of a 90-minute reading block that does use explicit and systematic instruction, and there are differentiated small groups, but they are one of 26 students in that group. And then as I move across and change tiers, those 2 students are still in that group, but now the group is smaller. It may be more explicit, it may be more systematic in that tier 2 support, addressing the needs that are aligned with their tier 1. And then tier 3, it's more intense again. It's a smaller group size. They're getting more instructional time that would be more explicit, more systematic, possibly integrating some cognitive strategies into help with cognitive processing and executive functioning for that tier 3 as well to intensify. So then just to myth one of these, we've just, in the session this morning, Sarah Seiko referred to one of the new modules that we have out on the National Center for Improving Literacy website. And this is from that new module that does go through a few facts and myths about dyslexia. This one specifically really kind of goes through what this looks like with tiers and instruction. So I pulled that into this presentation as well. The myth is that individuals with dyslexia have the same level of condition severity and experience the same level of difficulty learning to read. And that's not true. The fact is that dyslexia exists on a continuum. Some students have pretty mild forms of dyslexia, others have more severe forms of dyslexia, and that's going to be connected to the level of difficulty that that student has learning to read. So thinking about students existing on a continuum, also thinking that students with dyslexia are included across all those tiers of support based on the severity of their needs. So I may have some students who are in tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 that are students that are at risk for reading disabilities, including dyslexia. But I also may have some students who are just in tier 1 and tier 2, and they don't need that tier 3 level of support because their needs aren't that as severe as other students. So then looking at severity of dyslexia, along this left-hand side, you'll see those that are less severe and some characteristics that may be present in a less severe case of dyslexia. Difficulties in word level reading are primary underlying problem. You'll notice that's for both of these. That's what dyslexia is a trouble with phoneme coding letters to say sounds, to read words. So that comes up in both of these areas. Less severe is difficulties aren't exacerbated by other issues such as cognitive processing. So it's just the decoding that is difficult. And problems with comprehension and vocabulary development aren't necessarily compromised in a less severe case. Whereas if you're in the more severe category of dyslexia, still having some trouble with the word level reading difficulties, but then also cognitive processing can make it even more difficult. So if there are some deficits in working memory or deficits in your automatic processing, that may make your case more severe as well. And then secondary problems in comprehension and vocabulary arise. So because of the not being able to decode and read at the word level, comprehension of vocabulary is also sacrificed. You're not able to glean as much meaning from the text because it's more difficult to read. So then looking at a disconnect between research and practice, and we did touch on a little bit on this in the morning session too, but looking at, we have a ton of research of effective instruction and intervention. The field is especially in early reading. So looking at, it's not necessarily a knowledge gap. We know how students learn to read. There's lots of neuroscience coming out to add to what we already thought about students and how they learn to read. So it's not a knowledge gap, it's actually an action gap, according to Sally Shaywitz. And that is true. We go into classrooms across the nation, and it's not that teachers don't want to do a nice job or that schools aren't really wanting to do well and they have their best intentions in mind, but there really is an action gap because the knowledge isn't making it into the classrooms and into the buildings, into the school buildings. So really looking at how can we get that knowledge out there, and that's what I love about my job. I get to stand a foot in the research realm in the University of Oregon and then a foot in the classroom doors and in schools to help get that knowledge to become action in schools. So how do we do that? Two different questions here. One is, what is it about the student that makes him or her unable to learn? The second question that we're really going to focus on here today in this morning session is, what is it about the instruction that makes the student unable to learn? And those are two very different questions. very vastly different questions. So I could focus on the student. That's not necessarily a proactive approach. Or I could focus on the instruction because that's what I can change as a teacher. So that's what we're going to focus on this morning, is the instruction piece. What is it about the instruction that makes the student unable to learn? So how do we get there? We have to know and implement the science of reading. We have to use data to guide the instruction in all of those tiers, so benchmark, screening data, progress monitoring, mastery monitoring data. We know that other things may work, but it's not worth the risk of not following the research. There's a lot we could lose if we're not following what we know is best for students. And then committing to improving student reading outcomes, even if it means changing our practice, which is really uncomfortable. So thinking through, it can be very, very terrifying for me as a practitioner to change practice, but if I know that it's in the best interest of students, even though it's not an easy thing to do, it's something that I have to do because more students might be able to read if I would be willing to change my practice. So really looking at, so what can I do to change my practice to improve literacy outcomes for students? The science of reading simplified, because it's really not that simple, but there are some main ideas that we do have about the science of reading through research. It's crystal clear that students need to be systematically and explicitly taught. We know that through years and years and years of research. The national panel in 2000 looked at over 100,000 research articles, and it was very clear that this is how students learn to read. Phonics is not taught at a cost to vocabulary and comprehension. They work in conjunction with one another, so I'm not going to wait for students to master phonics before I teach them vocabulary and comprehension. Those pieces might be done orally and should be done orally while I'm teaching students how to learn the code through explicit and systematic instruction of phonics. And then curriculum maps that aren't necessarily publisher specific, they work as a supplement to the state standards to match the instruction to the science behind reading. So using the content from my curriculum map and what I know about how students learn to read, and then use that to guide my instruction in the classrooms. So what to teach? What are the 5 big ideas? And then we'll look at how to teach those 5 big ideas. The what is that there is insufficient time and content knowledge to teach everything every student needs to know in every core program. And if you're familiar with a core program, they'll tell you to use like 4 or 5 hours of your day to teach reading. That's just not realistic in a 6 or 7 or even 8 day classroom if you have a really long school day. So really looking at pulling out the big ideas of that curriculum to teach the most important content to students to ensure that they master that content. And research evidence supports pulling out those big ideas to focus on. Again, that National Reading Panel summarized research around that. And then Gersten in 2009 also looked at evidence and said, yep, that's a really good idea. We've got lots of strong evidence behind really teaching those 5 big ideas of reading. So we'll look at what those 5 big ideas are. And some of you are probably familiar with them. So looking at the changing of the emphasis of big ideas, this is going across the top in case you can't see it in the back, K1, 2, and 3, so by grade level. And then down is phonological awareness, alphabetic principle, automaticity and fluency with the code, vocabulary, and comprehension. So those are those 5 big ideas. We'll find them in a lot of core programs, but a lot of times there's lots of other fluff stuff that's hidden in there that takes up a whole lot of time. So taking that core program and really focusing in on these big 5 components and cutting to the chase through systematic and efficient and effective instruction to really hit these big 5 ideas. And then you'll see through the K3 continuum how things kind of phase in and phase out. Here, this is listening and reading. So knowing that if we're doing vocabulary and comprehension in the early grades, it's likely that that's going to be a lot of oral language, comprehension of vocabulary, which we know is important to reading and reading development. And then that will eventually kind of gradually become students who are reading to then do their own reading vocabulary and reading comprehension in a guided practice format. So then here, you've got letter sounds that fade into multisyllabic words, and then phonological awareness typically fades out around 1st grade, but that's not to say that there aren't later 1st graders and 2nd graders and even 3rd graders who still need to develop that phonological awareness. It's just hit really early from the beginning with students in kindergarten. And if students do still need phonological awareness instruction and later on in first and second and third grade on up, that's something that would be provided in that intervention piece as something to intensify for those students. So then in the morning session, Sarah really looked at just the simple view of reading. This is that simple view of reading, but it gets at a little bit more of the complexity behind a simple view. So looking at decoding times language comprehension equals reading comprehension. So that's what this D times LC equals RC is. And that's really that the value of either of these can't be 0 or I can't comprehend in reading instruction. So here, if I have no decoding skills, then I'm not going to get to reading comprehension, even if I have a lot of language comprehension skills in my back pocket to work with. So looking at decoding, this is breaking decoding out a little bit more into what all is decoding. This looks really simple in a decoding bubble, but this is really all of the kind of layers to that decoding piece. So you have print concepts and understanding the features of print, phonological awareness on the whole continuum, and we'll look at that slide next. Phonics and word recognition, word knowledge or your sight vocabulary. That's not necessarily that you're memorizing sight words, but it's that you have read those words and interacted with those words so much that they're kind of in this like word box in your brain, and you're able to read them with automaticity, which then leads to fluency with accuracy and rate for comprehension and expression. So then looking at these decoding skills, zooming in on students with dyslexia or at risk for dyslexia, often have a really hard time with this decoding piece. So this is that like bucket, if you will, out of these 2 buckets that we have to have for reading comprehension that can be really problematic for students with dyslexia. So all of these pieces, particularly this phonological awareness and that connection of letters and print to sound, is all, where the issues arise and where the difficulties arise for students with dyslexia. So then looking at this bubble here, especially for students with dyslexia, explicit and systematic phonics instruction is crucial. And we know that explicit and systematic phonics instruction helps wire the parts of the brain. We've seen it on like neuroimaging studies that if we teach, we can like forge pathways in the brain if we're using explicit and systematic instruction, which is really cool. If you're a practitioner like me, you're like, oh, I can like network your brain? That's amazing. But through explicit and systematic instruction, that can happen. So not asking students to cue, not guessing at words, not skipping over words, that's actually really connected to poor reading strategies. So if I'm asking students to guess at a word, I'm asking them to skip a word, or I'm asking to base it solely on context of a text they can't read because they can't decode it, then that's not forging that pathway there. So really looking at, yes, explicit and systematic instruction is really crucial for all students, but it's really crucial for students with or at risk for reading difficulties, including dyslexia. So looking at that phonological awareness continuum, because again, you can unpack each of these into subcomponents. This is just one example of that. So phonological awareness really starts with rhyming and alliteration and works its way up to phoneme blending and phoneme segmenting. So as I'm teaching students, especially in kindergarten and first grade, really making sure that I am teaching these components of phonological awareness to students. And it is a continuum. Phonemic awareness is at a sounds level. So it is per sound, like the word cat. I could segment cat into k, a, t. That is the most advanced. And then past that, you can like get into deletion and substitution. So but the sound level is the hardest to do. Rhyming and alliteration is like with word level. And all of phonological awareness is all sounds based. There's no print involved at all. But knowing that students need to have skills and phonological awareness before and as they're building their print awareness as well. So we don't have to wait for them to master all of these before we start teaching print. But it is crucial that we are developing phonological awareness while we're building phonics skills as well. And then looking at language comprehension. So again, unpacking the second component. What does that mean? And it really looks at academic language skills. So inferential language, comprehension skills with literal comprehension, narrative text, academic vocabulary, and then building background knowledge. And all of those pieces go into academic language skills that fill that language comprehension bucket that students need in order for that reading comprehension. to happen. And again, at kindergarten, first and second grade, a lot of this is going to be oral vocabulary, oral comprehension, oral academic language, until they can actually decode the words on the page and find meaning in the text to get to the reading comprehension. In the morning session, we also looked at Scarborough's rope. This is another image of that. Just again, getting at how these two have to blend together to get to reading comprehension. So you have your language comprehension bubble, you have your word recognition or your decoding bubble, and both of those weave together to create a skilled reader. So what you could see here, without one of those ends of the rope, you're not going to become a skilled reader. You have to have both. So one resource, and we talked about it a little bit in the morning session with Sarah, is this Foundational Skills Practice Guide. This is one of, I don't even know, like 20 or 30 they probably have on the What Works Clearinghouse website, which is down here. This is for this specific practice guide. But it goes through all of the research that has been done about foundational skills for teaching reading and breaks down into 4 components what should be taught in early reading K-3, and then gives examples of the research that found that information and examples to be integrated into instruction as well. And it's written in pretty friendly language as far as being applicable and able to be kind of digested by parents and teachers and practitioners. So now we've got the what to teach, now we'll look at the how to teach. The how to teach is through explicit and systematic instruction, and you're probably going to get really tired of me saying those words, but it's crucial to how we teach students to read. So explicit, just getting all on the same page and kind of level setting with explicit. Stated clearly and in detail, leaving no room for confusion or doubt. So I'm going to tell you, this is what we're going to do. And I'm not going to leave you guessing. I could, but that takes really valuable instructional time, and who's to say you would guess correctly? So I'm just going to tell you. Save you time, save me time, save us some frustration of not figuring it out, and then we'll move to like what we're doing next. So then systematic is having, showing, or involving a system, a method, or a plan. So I have a plan in place and I'm following that plan with my instruction. And then instruction is the act or process of teaching. So through my teaching, I should be stating things clearly and in detail while also having a plan in place. I know a method and I know how we're getting there as the instructor. Looking at explicit and systematic instruction, components of explicit instruction are on that left-hand side. So it's things like a teacher explanation, and that can just be very quick and very brief. We're going to practice saying sounds. If I keep talking and keep talking and keep talking, guess what my students are doing? Not listening anymore, right? So I'm going to cut to the chase, tell you really quickly what we're working on, and then get you into some student practice. Teacher model, I'm going to model what I want you to do. Watch me. I'll show you. So students know exactly what I'm asking of them. And then this huge piece here is that practice opportunities for all students. So I have all students practicing the material with me. I'm working with students as they're practicing. I'm providing corrective feedback as they're practicing and giving them multiple times to practice what I'm working with them on. And if they're not doing it correctly, I'm going to provide them corrective feedback, help them to correctly. Watch me again. Let's try this one together. So giving lots of practice for students to learn the content at an appropriate pace. So it's not going too fast, not going too slow, so I'm keeping all of my students with me. And then again, you see that corrective feedback and checks for understanding. So really checking in with students to make sure they're mastering the content I'm teaching. And then components of systematic instruction is breaking activities into smaller steps. So I'm not going to start huge and then expect you to figure it out. I'm going to break it into steps and have you master and complete those steps as we move to a bigger, more complex task. So that's that second bullet. They're sequential. Sarah talked about that, that they happen in order for students. She talked about that this morning in her session. And then that students have prior knowledge of the prerequisite skills. If I hand you a book and tell you to read the book, but I haven't taught you how to decode the words in that book, then that's not a sequential method to you reading. So really making sure if I'm asking you to read a text, that you have the decoding strategies, you know the sounds, you have some vocabulary knowledge of that book before I ever hand that book to you. So then this next video is an example of explicit and systematic instruction. It is teaching sounds. So you'll hear me tell them at the very beginning that they're going to teach sounds learn sounds. As you watch the video, think about how How are they getting practice opportunities? Did you see a teacher model? I'll tell you, before this, they saw a sound spelling card and learned the sound spellings for I, consonant, E. You'll also see it in the video. But I taught them that before they're doing their sounds in isolation. And then they're moving next, after this video, into blending words with these sounds in those words. So you won't see that whole progression in this particular video, but that's the breakdown in that systematic instruction. They saw the sounds with a picture cue, and then right after this video, they're working into blending sounds that are in this video into words, and then reading connected text with those words embedded as well. So that's kind of that systematic piece. Let me start the video real quick, and I'll get out of your way.
Ready? We're going to practice saying sounds. When I point to the sound, say the sound in your head. When I tap under the sound, you will say the sound out loud. My turn. Sound. I. Sound. E. Your turn. Sound. I. Sound. E. Oh, wait for the tap. Sound. E. Sound. I. Sound. I. So, my turn. Sound. I. Your turn. Sound. I. Yeah. Ready? Sound. E. Sound. I. Sound. I. Sound. E. Sound. Oh, first sound. E. Second sound. E. Third sound. I. Nice. Sound. I. Sound. E. My turn. Sound. I. Your turn. Sound. I. Wait for my tap. Sound. I. First sound. E. Second sound. E. Third sound. Look at the ice cream card. Third sound. I. There you go. Nice. Sound. I. Sound. Ice cream card. Look at it. Sound. I. There we go. First sound or short sound. Ah. Long sound. A. Sound. E. Sound. I. Sound. Sound. I. Sound. I. First sound. E. Wait for that tap. First sound. E. Second sound. E. Third sound. I. Sound. I. Nice job. Let's try some individual turns. I will point next to the sound. I will call one student. Only that student says the sound out loud. Sound. Armando. I. Beautiful. Sound. Eric. I. Sound. Think about it. Sound. Michaela. I. Nice job, guys. Excellent. Let's do it.
Right, so in there, explicit systematic instruction, just take like a minute to think about some things that you saw with explicit and systematic instruction, and then I'll kind of brief it with you. Just take a couple seconds. I'll go back to that slide so you can see it. Some of those things you saw in there. So thinking with the video, was there a teacher explanation? Hands up if there was a teacher explanation. We're going to practice saying sounds. Yep. Was there a model? Yep. My turn. And showed you the first two. Practice opportunities? Yeah. And the whole video, that is a whole lesson. This is about 11 minutes of instruction, and there are over 125 practice opportunities. So lots and lots and lots of student practice for everyone. Was it paced? Yeah, pretty rhythmic, pretty upbeat, but students could stay with it. And then you could see that corrective feedback and those checks for understanding. Corrective feedback after students miss an item, referring them back to the card. This is what we learned earlier. And then pulling that back together. And again, you won't really see that some systematic instruction so much in this example, but they did go from the cards and then they're moving into word reading after this. So there's that steps are sequential and breaking it into smaller steps. So then looking at this next one, just phonemic segmentation. This is another one, teaching again along that continuum, but phonemic segmentation, another way I could incorporate this, even if I have a core program that doesn't tell me to do it explicitly, I could say, here, tell me the sounds as I hold up a finger. Every time I hold up a finger, you say a sound in the word. I'll show you how to do the first one. My turn, cat, k, at. Your turn, cat. List. Fit. And I would go through the list and go through the list and go through the list. At the end, I would check for understanding and call a couple of you to check for understanding. So again, who was practicing there? All of my students, right? All of you, instead of just having that one. And then I showed you very quickly, this is what it's going to look like. This is what you're going to do. So thinking about those components with explicit instruction and overlaying them into the instruction that's happening in the classroom. Then example of academic vocabulary to get at that language comprehension bubble, looking at what I can do before reading, what I can do during reading and words in context when I come across it in the text. After reading, how can I build deeper understanding around the words that we're learning? And then what can I do throughout the year to really help build that academic vocabulary? And again, locate may not be a word that students decode, especially if they're first and second in kindergarten, but it's a word I can use oral language with to build vocabulary around. So then that also in turn builds their comprehension as well. And then looking at engagement for all students. So as part of explicit and systematic instruction, who's practicing? And it should be the majority of my students the majority of the time. All of my students, all of the time. So really looking at how can I get all of my students engaged in the instruction, oral response opportunities. I could have students partner with each other and respond while I'm monitoring those responses, discussions, and then not doing really individual turns where my students raise their hand and I call them students, because we know which students usually raise their hand, students that know it already. So a lot of times when I'm in classrooms, I'm not taking hands. Everyone have the answer ready. Everyone be thinking about it. So individual turns, yes, but I'm deciding a lot of times who those turns are going to, not just the hand raising. And then method is written. So I could have students using whiteboards or response cards. Some schools have clicker systems where all students can click in and make their, cast their vote essentially. And then writing frames for students. And then action. I could have students acting out things. I could have them using gestures, hand signals, facial expressions to tell me what they are communicating or what they're understanding about what we're reading or what we're working on. And then regardless of the method that you're using, whether it's written, whether it's verbal, whether it's an action response, all students are engaged in that practice opportunity. And that's really that equity issue. Like if I'm only giving a few chances for few students to respond, I am not teaching equitably. All of my students should have an opportunity to respond. All of them should have an opportunity to think before I ask them to respond. So really making sure that I'm giving them that think time and that processing time as well. Holding each student accountable for participating. It does require some intentional planning on the instructor's part, and then providing feedback to me as the instructor of what do I need to practice more? What do I need to lend some more instructional time on to adjust my instruction according to those the feedback I'm getting from students. And then looking at across tiers for instruction, core instruction and intensification. Teachers matter. They matter a lot. So looking at research suggests that curriculum, class size, district funding, family and community involvement, many other school-related factors all contribute to school success. That's not contested any. We know that those things do affect student outcomes. But the single most influential school-based factor is the teacher. And there are multiple studies that have come out about this, about the effectiveness of a teacher, how much it builds upon. If I have a poor teacher 1 year, it can take me up to 3 years to fill those voids and to fill those gaps. Looking at if I have an effective teacher, my percentage outcomes are significantly higher than if I have a poor teacher, that same grade that's taking in all these other accounts. If the teacher is poor, my outcomes as a student are also poor. So there's a lot of correlation between strong teachers, between effective teachers, and the ability for students to learn to read or to learn any content. This could be mathematics or anything, right? Effective teacher in whatever we were just talking about in the context of literacy for this particular setting. And then we know that implementation matters. So a lack of implementation fidelity might result in a practice or a program being less effective. So if I'm implementing, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, if I'm implementing something and I'm not implementing it as it was designed, it's likely to be less effective. And then when programs are implemented with fidelity are compared to programs that aren't implemented with fidelity, the difference in an effectiveness is profound. It yields a lower effect size that are 2 to 3 times lower, or if it's implemented effectively, 2 to 3 times higher than if I don't implement something as it's intended. So again, if I have a program and it's been scientific and scientific research, evidence-based research, and I'm not implementing with it how it was designed to be implemented, I am setting myself up to 2 or 3 points lower for that implementation and for the effect size for my students. So looking at the level of instructional support, again, here's that triangle just represented a little bit differently, but really looking at that tier 1 because that's really where it starts. I could have a tier 2 and I have a tier 3, but if my tier 1's not solid, I'm not ever going to catch all of my students up. I just can't do it. I should not have all of my students in a tier 3 intervention. Should never happen. Or my core, something's wrong with the core part of my program. So then looking at a strong core, is instruction implemented effectively? Is there small group differentiation? Is screening process in place for students in that core? And is there a plan in place for response to screening? So if my students don't respond, what do I do? How do I adjust that instruction? And again, here, is it focused on the components of reading? If it's not, that's also not going to produce a strong core. So looking at intensification for students who aren't successful in that tier 1, how do I know when to intensify instruction? One time that I could intensify, or one case that I could intensify, is when students aren't responding to their current instruction. So I could add a layer of intensification. If students aren't responding to tier 1, I could make some changes and have them participate in a tier 2 intervention. If they're not responding in tier 1 and tier 2, and it's being implemented with fidelity, and I'm using explicit and systematic instruction, and students still aren't responding in tier 1 and tier 2, and I could add a tier 3 potentially for intensive intervention. Or students who are reading significantly below grade level. If I have a student who is significantly below grade level, I may intensify a lot quicker to help with that early intervention piece. So then research on intensification, what does research say? It says that the instruction should match the learner needs. And the only way I can do that is through assessment. So looking at pieces of assessment to drive that instruction. To integrate strategies that support cognitive processing when necessary. So looking at self-regulation, looking at working memory, looking at executive functioning. And then differentiating instructional delivery, making it more explicit, more systematic than what they were getting before. Increasing instructional time and reducing that group size, like we saw on the circle slide earlier. As they move across the continuum in tiers, their group sizes will likely decrease as well. For a resource for this, and I love this resource put out by NCIL, the National Center for Improving for Intensified Interventions, is the taxonomy of intervention intensity, and it gives 7 dimensions on the left-hand side, and what does that mean? How do I intensify that dimension? We're going to look just at dosage and comprehensiveness for purposes here, for time-wise, but you could go through each of these dimensions and really look closely at that. There are great online modules and videos that talk through each of these dimensions as well. But looking at dosage, what does that look like across the tiers? So looking at tier 1, what does time allotment look like? And you'll see that it increases as you move across. So each of these tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 are in addition to the tier 1. We're not taking students out of tier 1. They still get tier 1. All students get tier 1, but then adding some additional instructional time. Grouping, you'll see the group moves across, and that is one way to intensify the dosage for students. And then the duration. So core instructions happens all year, should be happening all year, every day in the classroom. It should be prioritized in buildings. I know that's not always the case in school buildings, but that should be the case, that core reading instruction is happening all day, or all days of all school years, of the all school year. And then less than 20 weeks, I could reevaluate at the end of that 20 weeks or the end of that 18 weeks. I may decide I still need to keep a student in an intervention, or I may decide that they have caught up with their peers and they can just be back in core with some monitoring. And then 20 or more weeks, maybe my tier 3 intervention time. And then again, practitioner facilitating the group. Typically it's the general education teacher in tier 1. Tier 2 often is an interventionist specialist or an educational assistant. Could be the general ed teacher too. That happens in some cases in schools as well. Big idea here is that students who are at the most need are with very skilled instructors. So just making sure that those that are delivering interventions in buildings are trained to deliver interventions with explicit and systematic instruction. And that's across tiers, Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3. And then you'll see some other potential service providers or practitioners in Tier 3. That could be where special educational assistants or instructors come into play there, or some content specialists as well. And then comprehensiveness and explicit instruction. Again, you'll see those move across as we go across the continuum for tiers. They get more intense as you move from the left to the right. So the top is opportunities to respond. All students are responding in whole group and small group. And then at least 6 to 8 student responses a minute is recommended for Tier 2. And then you see that increase to 8 to 12 student responses per minute in Tier 3. So again, how do we increase that opportunities to respond? How can we get all students engaged in that material? And then pre-correction, what drives pre-correction for students? Scaffolding. And we'll look a little more closely at this on the next slide, but looking at the scaffolding based on students' assessed skills in Tier 1, using an I do, we do framework. And then I do, we do, you do gets more intense in Tier 2 and more intense in Tier 3, which we'll look at. And then judicious review is integrated in systematic instruction. I am integrating review of concepts throughout the year for Tier 1. And then students in Tier 2 will be reviewing and practicing core concepts that are taught in Tier 1, and then intensive practice of content or remediation of content in that Tier 3 setting. So here's one, just a scaffolding example to kind of unpack that a little bit more. In Tier 1, you can see how the we do's grow quite a bit in Tier 2, and then lots more we do's in Tier 3. So when we're talking about intensifying, I'm not necessarily changing a program, but I'm giving students more scaffolding, more practice opportunities as I move across those tiers. So then looking at some additional resources, I'll leave this slide up here. I know some of you are taking some photos, but the next few slides, we're just going to run through a few of these resources that are here. Some of them were in the PowerPoint earlier, and then some of them are kind of embedded after this. So we'll look at what those resources are. One is the National Center for Improving Literacy website, and that is improvingliteracy.org. At the top, there's a tab for parents and families. That one that's highlighted in yellow is for parents and families, so you can click on that. Tons of resources in there. Across the top are also for schools and districts, for state agencies and tools. You're welcome to explore those too, but that one's just more applicable for the parents and families piece. There are a ton of literacy briefs that you can find on the NCIL website. These are ones that specifically talk for parents, but looking at key roles for children's literacy success, how your child benefits from the homeschool connection, looking at learning about your child's reading development, and then how to be your child's guide. And there's ones for phonics, there's ones for reading, there's ones for helping them with comprehension. Quite a few of those. I just pulled one off of the site. And then the resource repository is another resource. So in tools and resources, the resource repository gives you lots of searchable resources. So you can search by topic, you can search by audience, you can search by just typing in in the search box, and then it will bring up multitude of resources that are all evidence-based. So instead of like Googling on Pinterest, what can you find? Which, I mean, I love Pinterest for craft projects, but for education that is backed in research, maybe not the best resource. So this is one we've kind of done some of that legwork for you. This is not the Pinterest of searching. This is like, oh, these were like actually gone through and people looked at them, they reviewed them, they had to go through a review process before they were ever posted on the website. So it kind of takes out some of that guesswork on your part. And then toolkits, we just added an Understanding Dyslexia toolkit that came out. So in the toolkits section under tools and resources, there are several, but the Understanding Dyslexia one was the one that was just most recently released like a week and a half ago. And it's full of, there's a tutorial on there, there's infographic links there, there's some resource links in that tutorial, so you can just go straight to the toolkit. So going straight to the toolkit will get you quite a few resources about dyslexia. And then there's an intensification toolkit on its way. So we have that one under works, but it hasn't gone live yet. Practice guides, great resource for you or for teachers. This is the one that we looked at today with that foundational skills piece, but there are tons of them on the IAS website. Again, all based on rigorous evidence. This is one of those examples of the practice guide for multi-tiered systems of support. And then implementing evidence-based practices. This is put out by REL, Southeast. And it goes through what does evidence look like in a building and tries to guide leaders and practitioners in selecting evidence-based practices for implementation in school buildings. And then the intensive intervention site. So this is NCII's site, and this is where the intensification framework came from that we looked at the dosage and the comprehensiveness from. That's on this website. Along with an interactive module, a self-paced module around intensive intervention and database decision making. And then there's the taxonomy that we looked at earlier today. And then that is all I have for you today. That leaves 5 minutes for questions, which I know is not a ton of time, but I will also be here after today too. So if you have questions, I'll be here if I don't get them answered now. So wait for the mic to get to you before you answer your question or ask your question.
I know a couple parents who are homeschooling their kids who have kids with reading issues. What would you suggest for them? Are the resources that you presented here, are they available for homeschooling families?
Yeah, all of the resources on the NCIL website and NCII as well are free. They're all free resources. The biggest thing with any school, whether it's homeschool or in like in sites in a building, public or private, is that there's a systematic process to teaching students. So just having a systematic process, regardless of your system. None of these resources are going to be like a systematic process. They're things to supplement the systematic process that's already there. So just using these and kind of picking and choosing in isolation isn't necessarily the best practice, but pulling these resources to support something that is explicit and systematic that's already in place would be great.
In addition to the direct and explicit, can you describe the multisensory components that are used and manipulatives? We didn't see that in that example, but I'm sure they're there, and I'm just wondering if you could expand on the direct and explicit to include multisensory and synthetic and analytic.
Yeah, sure. So there isn't any multisensory in explicit and systematic instruction in this presentation. There's actually not a ton of research that supports multisensory in the sense of like tapping and touching and like kinesthetic and things like that. Multisensory in regards to listening, speaking, reading, and writing, yes, students should be doing all of those things. They should be listening, they should be speaking, they should be reading, they should be writing. But in the sense of like multisensory that like I need to have movement or I need to like be feeling something or touching something, there's actually not a ton of research out about that and the effectiveness of that. Not saying that it's like not effective, but we have no research that's saying it is. Very, very limited research around multisensory and no research that says multisensory is more effective than explicit and systematic instruction on its own. And IDA touches on that on their website as well and addresses the lack of evidence that really proves that multisensory instruction is what students need.
Hi, I was wondering, on one of your first or second slides, you talked about the curriculum map. And I think one of the challenges that a lot of our districts are facing is that we have a whole language or balanced literacy ELA curriculum. And then some of our teachers are receiving like OG or, signs of reading instruction. And I'm just wondering about your work or anything you could comment on how do we marry those two? I mean, you might say pass on my question, and that's okay if you do.
I don't know how you marry. I've yet to see anywhere that I will say this. I have yet to see anyone in my work that has married the two well and that it's working. I have yet to see it. I won't say that it does. I have my quandaries about whether I think it exists, but I have doubts that it is very effective, and we know what's effective. There's actually a study getting ready to start up that you all might be very interested in following that I am a part of out of the University of Oregon and it's looking at multi-tiered systems of support. It's a 4-year study, huge study across the nation, 5 schools and 10 districts across the nation. And it's looking at 3 kind of different kind of prongs of research. One is that it's business as usual in schools. So whatever their business as usual is that's what those students will be kind of randomly assigned to in groupings. One is multi-tiered system support with aligned tier 1 and tier 2. So what's happening in their core program is pre-taught in their tier 2 program using explicit and systematic instruction. And then prong 3 of that is that there's a core program in their like main tier 1 setting. There's intervention happening in a tier 2, but there's not necessarily alignment between tier 1 and tier 2. So at the end of 5 years, we'll have some data around that. I mean, data will start, that kicks off in August. So I'll actually be out coaching in the second prong, aligned tier 1 and tier 2. But then we'll be collecting data from all of those sites and seeing, hey, what does the evidence show? Because right now we don't have super solid evidence that, I mean, we know through like scientific, but there's no evidence of that. So getting into some schools and really rolling out a study that studies that. Yeah. And I am past my time, so I'm going to honor your time. If you want to continue to ask questions, I'm going to put down the mic. That way you all can go eat. But if you want to ask questions, please feel free to come up. I'll be here until I'm not anymore.
Okay, thank you so much, Jess, for your presentation.